Okay, hello everyone, welcome. I'm Todd Fernandez with Climate Crisis Policy, and I'll be your host today. I'll be quick with the opening today so we can get right to the great speakers and important topics. As we know, the United States Congress is obviously still dominated by big oil, as even the simplest of obvious incentives for clean energy are being killed by the Republicans and two Democrats. As a $150 billion investment in clean energy is cut for utilities to go renewables, and the methane gas fee is also under the knife. Meanwhile, big oil tax subsidies are safely in place, even in the House where Democrats have a safe margin. And as you know, we're headed to the 26th gathering of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It's sad to say that the Paris approach of voluntary NDCs is not working either. The terrifying truth is that 2020 was the highest greenhouse gas emissions in history. Governments are planning to produce more than twice as much fossil fuels than what would enable us to stay below 1.5 planetary heating. And the current Paris nationally determined contributions are on target to raise greenhouse gas emissions by 16% by 2030. All of this says we're on track for 2.5 to 3 degree warming with no end in sight. And yet the COP26 agenda does not even include discussions of other treaty approaches like the Montreal, the Valley agreements to ban greenhouse gases. Real solutions are not even in the table as we go over the cliff, pedal to the metal, hoping with our heads in the sand that the United Nations, which doesn't really solve many of the problems it talks about, is our only hope, with the UN Security Council dominated by big oil controlled countries. So today we're focused on plans B, C, and D to solve this crisis and ban greenhouse gas pollution like we did ozone depleting pollution and recently hydrofluorocarbons. First, we'll talk about new treaty approaches, and then we'll dive into the US EPA's power to regulate greenhouse gases. After this, we'll return to the fight at hand in Congress and talk about ways to engage there. And we'll share updates on the Earth Bill. That bill is a key strategy domestically, and it's very important that we lead the legislative strategy, particularly given what has just happened with the movement push this Congress. Before we start, I want to lift up again the Sunrise Youth and a protracted hunger strike outside the White House, Extinction Rebellion and others who blocked highways in New York City this week, Green Faith and others who were involved in BlackRock actions, and all those taking direct action to force our governments to do what's right and necessary. Bravo to all of you. You are our best hope and last hope. With that, let's hear from the experts. To get us started, I'm very glad to introduce Scott Barrett, who is the Vice Dean at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs, a member of the Earth Institute faculty, and the Lindfest Earth Institute. Welcome, Scott. We're so grateful to have you. And we didn't get a chance to talk before, but I'm very excited to hear what you have to say. And please take it away.
Thank you so much, Todd. Thanks for this invitation. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Okay, great. Yeah, I'm having computing problems, so I'm doing this from my telephone. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm a little nervous because this is a group of activists, so I know you're all charged up, and Todd's welcome was, a pretty moving introduction to where we are and what the problem is and what lays before us. My approach is to step back a little bit, and I just want to explain why. When we look at the world, we see it. We see a mess. Actually, there are some good things too. Our attention tends to be drawn to what's not going well as opposed to what has gone well. But we see a mess, and we get upset about that, and we want it to change. And I think our normal impulse is to just insist that it be changed. My approach is a little different. It's about asking, why is it messed up in the first place? Why wasn't the problem fixed? We've been negotiating on climate change for over 30 years. Why have we not been successful? So I approach it from that perspective first. Because the reason it's important, if you don't know the reason why it has been unsuccessful, you won't know how to propose remedies that will be more effective. So I don't think this is just a matter of caring. I don't think it's a matter of being vocal only. I think it's a matter of understanding why we failed and how we could do better. So this is what I want to focus on. I want to give a little history to this too. I'm an old guy and I've been around a long time. I was at the first meeting in 1992, actually advising the UN at that stage on climate. And I've been sticking with it ever since. I've never felt we were doing it the right way. I still believe we're not doing it the right way. I think we could do better. I think we have to be realistic, and we're not going to do what we need to do at the right time. It's not happening. It hasn't happened. Todd said that. But what we really need to focus on is how can we do better? And I think this is a hard thing for a lot of people to accept, and I understand this. Why should we not ask for the ideal? That seems like you're giving up before we even start. And what part of my work shows is that when you go for the ideal, you may actually fail quite badly. If you go for something less than ideal, but with a higher chance of working, you do better. But that's a hard thing for people to accept, and I know that. Why should we accept something that isn't ideal? Let me just sort of just give a brief history, because I think that context is really important. I assume a lot of you are younger. You haven't really been observing what's been happening over a very long period of time, or maybe you've been observing and there's an issue about interpretation. This issue about climate change really emerged in the late 1980s, and it actually very much emerged. I really was awfully glad Todd mentioned the Montreal Protocol, and I know that's going to be discussed later. I do want to come back to that. This issue really emerged right after, emerged as a public global issue right after the Montreal Protocol was negotiated. So I'm talking 1988, that really emerged as a big issue. And a meeting was convened in another Canadian city, Toronto, to try to deal with climate change. This meeting was not official, so it's not like the COP. UN negotiations hadn't begun yet. It was semi-official. So some of the same people actually involved in Montreal were there, government officials were there, NGOs were there, scientists. So it was a very mixed group. But what's really important to know is that this group in 1988 said what the world ought to do is act together to ensure the CO2 emissions in 2005 are 20% below the 1988 level. So they started off with a collective target for the world on CO2. And I think it's really important to understand that that's kind of where we are now. The target looks different. It's in terms of temperature change, which no one controls. No one controls global emissions either, which is part of the problem. But nonetheless, we started off that way. We had a target, and that target at that time was a reasonable target. It was not met, obviously, but at that time, it was a reasonable target. Then what happened was, again, that was semi-official. Then it went to countries, and they ended up saying unilaterally, what are they going to do? And they proposed all sorts of targets. But then they realized, wait a minute, why should I meet my target if I can't be sure you're going to meet your target? And all that really matters is that we all act together to address this problem. So it's really from that perspective that we came to the UN in 1990 and initiated a process of negotiation. That negotiation led to the Framework Convention on Climate Change and adopted in Rio in 1992. People will probably forget, but actually the intent of those negotiations was to get countries to agree to binding emission reductions. That failed. Instead, you've got some vague wording about what countries ought to do. And it's really because of that vague wording that this agreement is successful, in the sense that every country is a party to it. So one way to have a treaty in which everyone is a party is to not ask them to do anything. So we're pretty good at that. Now, the issues still remain to be addressed, and then the negotiations continued, and that led to the Kyoto Protocol. Kyoto Protocol is actually a stunningly modest effort, because it was really only asking a pretty small fraction of the world to reduce emissions a little bit and just for 5 years. So it really wasn't even very ambitious, but the intent was that that was to lay the foundation for subsequent protocols that would involve more and more countries doing more and more over time. I was deeply critical of this approach from the very beginning because it was all predicated on the ability to enforce the obligations that were being negotiated. And I could not see how that could be done. And in fact, the treaty specifically says in Article 18 that any mechanism that is to apply to compliance with binding consequences must be agreed by an amendment. Well, amendment is basically a separate treaty or a connected treaty, but it's a separate treaty in the sense that it only binds the countries that ratified the amendment. The amendment was never negotiated. It was discussed. It was never negotiated. It was never completed. It never came up. So you actually had an agreement that actually wasn't asking for very much, but was asking of real things to be done by a relatively small subset of countries, but without this enforcement. And of course, one of the first things that happened, the US said it would not participate. By the way, that's not just a Republican issue. The people voting against US joining in terms of this non-binding Senate resolution that preceded the final negotiation of the treaty, that had support of both parties, unanimous, by the way, okay, including Senator John Kerry. So this is not only, it is very much a political issue in the United States and polarization, as Todd was saying. I understand that. I'm not disagreeing with that at all. It's just that to see only that is also to not see the full picture. Anyway, so when the US now doesn't participate, that makes the other countries less willing to participate. So for this treaty to come into force, they had to renegotiate essentially through the back door. That treaty, by the way, adopted in 1997, the negotiations continued for years after that. And in those negotiations, basically they made it easier for other countries to join by not asking them to do as much. And in the end, none of this could really be made to work. One important moment was when Canada withdrew. Canada ratified the treaty, adopted no policies for meeting it, was obviously not going to comply. And the easiest thing to do is to walk away. That's how the international system works. So we need to understand that that's how it works and then ask how we can get it to work better. Copenhagen was meant to, in a sense, double down on Kyoto and make it broader and more effective. And that whole negotiation collapsed. You knew it was going to collapse because leading up to that conference, there were 5 different treaty texts being distributed. And basically all those treaty texts, if you read them, they're all saying, these are all the things that we cannot agree on. Like you cannot have success in a negotiation when the emphasis is on what we don't agree on. You have to find what we can agree on. Anyway, so that all kind of collapsed. And in the moment of Copenhagen, I think about a 2.5-page agreement called the Copenhagen Accord, that is not an official agreement, was crafted. And what they did there was to say, let's go back to ask individual countries what they're willing to do. So we're going to set a global goal that was already set there at 2 degrees C. And we're going to turn to countries now and ask, what are you willing to do to help meet that? And that led to this process that ultimately restored the UN effort and led to Paris. Now, as Todd mentioned, in Paris, countries are pledging what are called INDCs, intended nationally determined contributions. And you can actually look at the language of that and see how the initial effort in Kyoto has been watered down over time. This is intended, so it's not something that's required. Nationally determined, it's not negotiated. Countries say themselves what they're willing to do. Contributions, well, in Kyoto, people were using the term commitment. I didn't think that was the right word because there literally was no commitment, but nonetheless, moving from commitment to contributions, you see what's happening and you're getting this watering down. And the watering down is simply reflecting the reality that the approach they were taking was unsuccessful. And the only thing countries were willing to sign up to was something that was voluntary. So Paris is essentially voluntary. Now, the one thing that's a bit novel about Paris is that it includes a kind of a framing where there can be a kind of a naming and shaming. So you're going to have these so-called stock taking. You know, where is the world now? Todd's summary is quite accurate. Actually, global emissions from 1750 to 1990, when the negotiations started, the cumulative emissions over that entire time are less than the world's emissions since negotiations began in 1990. Concentrations in the atmosphere have increased every year without failure. Emissions are a little lower 2020 because of COVID, but you can't tell by looking at the concentration level that there's been any impact at all. Okay, so I think that there's no other way to interpret this as a failure. This naming and shaming, however, seems to be somewhat novel. And I could see this coming because I was looking at the treaty negotiation text and teamed up with a colleague, Astrid Dannenberg, a professor in Germany. And we conducted an experiment to see whether that context of naming and shaming would actually change behavior. And what was so cool about this is because we could see the text, we knew what was coming up to Paris, we were able to do the experiment. And I was able to present it in Paris to show the negotiators right there that this plan that you have, which was undertaken without any analysis, as far as I'm aware of, we just sort of stumbled into this voluntary approach with naming and shaming, that it's unlikely to be effective. Meaning, what I mean is, maybe they'll achieve something. It's going to be impossible to ever know because we don't have the counterfactual what would have happened without this Paris Agreement. It might possibly achieve something, but I think it's completely, it will not achieve its of meeting these collective targets of keeping temperature change within 2 degrees C. I'm very confident about that. You actually know, and Todd was alluding to this, you actually know in Paris, the Secretariat to the Framework Convention presented an analysis that showed that if countries fulfill their INDCs, which are meant to get you to this 2-degree goal, or 1.5 if you want to say that, if they fulfill those obligations, global emissions are going to keep rising through 2030. So, and it's impossible. It's impossible to stabilize the climate when global emissions are rising. You have to bring net emissions to zero. Now, of course, we know everyone today is saying net zero, net zero, net zero. It's all we're ever hearing, but these are just more the targets that we've been hearing about since the late 1980s. And the question really is going to be, is there going to be, we are going to see real action. In our experiment, again, I did with Astrid Dannenberg, what we find is that this naming and shaming has an influence on the collective target. So it makes the collective target a little harder. So that's good. It has a little bit of effect on the pledges that are made. They're a little higher than it would have been without it. But in the end, it has no effect on the actual contributions. So what I mean by that is the Secretariat is saying, if countries fulfill their obligations, we'll do a little better than we would have done if we didn't have Paris. We'll never observe this, but that's what they're saying. But what I'm saying is we can't even assume that they're going to fulfill their obligations. Now, of course, there are other things that are going to be happening. You know, energy markets are changing, prices are changing, technology is changing, population is growing, GDP, all these different things are happening, right? So no one has control over this whole system. And it may just by accident turn out that we do better. But I'm very skeptical of this. And I think we need to do better. Now, in Kigali, I think about 9 months after Paris, as Todd mentioned, a different agreement was negotiated. That was under the Montreal Protocol, which is meant to protect, it has been brilliantly successful in protecting the ozone layer. A lot of issues about where ozone is right now, but leaving that aside, this is a brilliant agreement. So don't be negative about the UN approach, by the way. It has worked. It worked in Montreal. The thing is, we just approached climate the wrong way. So what Kigali does is it regulates the emissions of hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, which are a greenhouse gas. And the reason I think Kigali will be effective is because the design of that treaty is very different from Kyoto. And the most important part of this is that it includes trade measures between the countries that are in and the countries that are out. So I'm pretty confident that this will work. I actually am even confident that the US Senate, as insane as it is, could ratify this agreement, and I certainly hope that they will. Now that opens the question, well, if that's successful, why don't we do this more broadly? And that's one of the areas that's going to attract a lot of attention. That is coupling trade with climate. Can we use the trade weapon as a way to promote cooperation on climate? Basically, this is less easy than you might think. So we have to be careful. We have to go into this understanding how effective it can be. The conditions that allow this to happen are it's not clear to me how much they actually apply. So that's something that needs to be investigated. But one thing I would say is I think that the right approach to go is to look at different sectors and not just to look at the economy as a whole. Yeah, in terms of climate, it's the economy as a whole that matters. But in terms of where there's leverage in the international system to get action, I would encourage a look at sectors. And this is work that I'm undertaking. HFCs are an example, but there are numerous other sectors. So you're trying to take this colossal problem and break it up into pieces. And when you do that, you're not going to look at what individual countries are doing. You're going to look at the system as a whole, the entire world, and ask, how can we change that system? Okay. So HFCs are an example. We can't just replicate that for other sectors. There are going to be things that are specific to each one. But I think that is a focus we need to adopt. and that can be done in parallel with Paris. So this is not actually a criticism of Paris. We can do this in parallel with Paris. And the last thing I would say is, to get a real grip on this issue, we really need to do something much more ambitious than just trying to change behavior. And in particular, what I'm pointing to is this critical backstop technology of technologies that can remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Things have gotten out of control. They're not going to come into control very quickly. This is the only backstop technology that exists. There should be much more investment so that we know if this technology works, how well it works, how safe it is to store the CO2, how costly it is. Because if we can acquire that information, then there's the possibility that the world can invest in a project, and that project would be to build these machines to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. That's different from trying to change behavior. I agree that changing behavior is the ideal. I agree with that, and we should pursue that as far as we can. But given that this problem that's looming before us, I think we also need to put emphasis on, in a parallel approach, development of this technology, which again is the only backstop we have for climate change.
Scott, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm going to interrupt for 1 second if I can. That was great. And then I want to keep you on the line. We have another speaker who has to leave in 5 minutes because he has a class he's teaching. So I'm just going to give him a few minutes to chime in. We want to welcome Eric Dean Wilson, teaching fellow at the Mellon Seminar on Public Engagement at CUNY, and who has authored a book on that involves a lot of discussion of the Montreal Protocol. Eric, thank you so much for joining us. For as long as you have, would you like to chime in here?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Todd, and thank you so much, Scott. It's brilliant, everything that you said, and what a concise and vivid history of the past 30, 40 years of climate policy. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Everybody hear me okay? So I just want to say a couple brief words that just kind of emphasize or echo some of the things that Scott said. And one of the things is really, so I come from a very different perspective, partially kind of an accidental historian, and really a writer, and I teach English and rhetoric. So I sort of come from the side of narrative, but I did a lot of research about the history of refrigerants, of Freon, CFCs, and HFCs, and implications of climate, and stumbled into the story of the Montreal Protocol. And I want to kind of emphasize what Scott was saying, is that I was surprised to find how hopeful the story of the Montreal Protocol is. I don't want to romanticize it or make it rosy, but it really is the first and to this date only successful international legally binding environmental treaty to prevent looming environmental disaster. And that's I don't want to emphasize the only part of that, but it's worth noting what was so successful about it and how it still has a major impact on saving us from the worst of the sun's radiation. One of the things I think that made it so successful is that there was a clause in it that it had to be revisited every year in light of revised science, ozone science, that countries would share resources, and that it was mandatory to revise or strengthen the details of the agreement in light of those scientific findings. And this is what led to Kigali and some of the goals that they proposed to just phase down but not phase out CFCs initially were revised pretty quickly. And the targets for those dates were moved closer. And one thing that I think is really interesting is that because a lot of refrigerants are major global warming gases, there have been a couple of studies that have shown that the Montreal Protocol has gone further in saving the world from heating, from global warming, than Kyoto's goals were, sort of by accident. It wasn't designed to mitigate climate change, but it was so successful at phasing out CFCs worldwide that it actually has gone farther in meeting climate goals than the Kyoto Protocol has. The other thing to note is that it is legally binding and that the US was part of that. And that is something that I want to emphasize that has been ever since the Montreal Protocol, something that we haven't quite been able to replicate. There's a way in which you could see, it's kind of hard to prove this directly, but there's a way in which to see the US failure to really embrace Kyoto as a reaction against the Montreal Protocol. As Scott pointed out, that resolution, the Byrd-Hagel resolution, was unanimous. Democrats and Republicans all penned a resolution about a few months before Kyoto was decided on, that they would not agree to any kind of legally binding international treaty that did not have legally binding emissions for so-called developing countries, which is what Kyoto was defined as. So this is something that was really part of the Clinton administration. It was something that was part of the Bush administration, and it was something that was part of the Obama administration. Didn't really matter Republican or Democrat. There was a real hostility in the Senate to agreeing to climate, legally binding climate provisions internationally that did not also include the same or comparable provisions for developing countries or for a place like China or India or Indonesia, which is of course wildly unfair because historically the United States is the largest polluter. This is something that I think we should really, really, really be aware of, because it's part of why the United States Clinton didn't even send the Kyoto Protocol to the Senate to be ratified, because as the story goes, he suspected that it would be rejected. It's part of why Copenhagen sort of failed to rope in the United States. And I also think it's part of the reason why Paris failed to really nail down legally binding emissions targets for the US, because it knew that it would not pass the Senate. So without saying, something dire about that, I think it's really important to keep in mind that this belief that legally binding emissions targets being ratified by the Senate, I think we should really emphasize that. And I think that we should really hold that in mind as we think about another way forward, is that it has historically been really unpopular. That doesn't mean it's impossible, but I think it's worth realizing that as we've tried to come up with international treaties that are legally binding, one major hurdle was its failure to be ratified by the Senate, especially now that we have a Senate where 52 senators would probably be opposed to this. I think probably that's all I have to say, all I have time to say. But I just want I'm sorry that I can't stay longer. And I want to again extend my gratitude to Todd and to Scott for inviting me here. And I look forward to joining you all in the future again.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much, Eric. I'm sorry time is rushed and short, but I appreciate you being here, and it's just the beginning of the conversation as we start to put our thinking caps on to how civil society can start driving a conversation about what needs to happen in the face of all these obstructionist governments. So thank you very much. And Scott, if it's okay with you, can we go ahead to our next speaker and then circle back on a couple questions? Do you have time for that?
Eric was terrific, by the way. I'm gonna have to leave. Unfortunately, I have to teach too. This is what we do, professors. So I have to leave in about, the longest I can stay is 15 minutes. So that'd be 10 to 1.
All right. Well, Matt, can we get just
let you know.
One question in with Scott, and then we'll turn to the EPA and the jurisdiction of the EPA. Is that okay?
That works.
All right, great. So Scott, before you go then, what's the next best step forward and on international treaty proposals or approaches? And what could civil society do to help lead that conversation and narrative, as opposed to waiting for these co-opted governments to hopefully, sprout new feathers and change colors and be something other than what they are? My belief is that civil society is our last great hope, and that we're going to have to rally to demand something new. So what would you see would be the next step on that path, and what would that look like in a few minutes? As the beginning of the conversation.
Yeah, no, very, very good question. I think that the temptation is probably to argue for tougher targets. And I'm not opposed to that, so don't take it that way. But I think if that's all we do, I think we're probably likely to get the same kind of result we've had in the past. We should make the most of Paris we can. So I think that I'm not critical of Paris in the sense of wanting to abandon it. Kyoto, I thought, was counterproductive. Paris, I think, is productive, but it just won't go far enough. I think what we need to do is create this ability to understand what the international system is able to deliver. Just on Eric's point, and it's relevant for this, he said that he was absolutely right. Montreal is a brilliant agreement. It really is. And the reason people don't take it so seriously is because it works. We tend to focus a lot more on the things that don't work. It's not the only example of a treaty that works. In the environmental area, one I like is called the Marpol Treaty on reducing the introduction of oil by oil tankers into the seas. That has been extremely successful agreement. And looking at the fisheries area, there was an agreement negotiated in 1911 on managing the fur seal in the North Pacific. Now you might say, well, what does that really matter? Because that seal could have gone extinct because of overexploitation. That treaty was perfectly effective. If you look outside the environmental area, another one I worked on is the eradication of smallpox worldwide. What an amazing achievement. And whenever anyone is dismissive of the UN, just think about the things that have been achieved, including that. So what we have to do is understand from these relatively small number of exceptional successes, how we could do better. And the basic insight that comes from this for me is that instead of fighting sovereignty, you kind of have to go with the grain of sovereignty and use some leverage to get it to work in the direction that we all want it to go in. And that's actually what's going on in the Montreal Protocol. And that's what those trade measures are doing. But again, I think it's wrong to think that linking to trade just by itself is enough. The conditions have to be right. It has to be done in quite the right way. But what I would really suggest be the focus is that we open up space. And I think people should be encouraging the Biden administration to be thinking more creatively, not in conflict with Paris, but more creatively about how we can address this. And the focus should be on sectors, and the focus should be not on what the US is doing, but on what the US can do to help transform an entire sector and how it works globally. So that's what we're looking at, is systemic change globally. That's the thing that's more important than any individual country's emissions, because that's not going to matter so much. And I think I saw one person ask some question, what would you do? Well, these things are not trivial, and these are things I'm working on now. But I think you start looking at sectors, what you're looking at then, let's look at aluminum, let's look at steel, let's look at glass, let's look at cement, let's look at cars. When you look at cars, you also have to look at, that's the hardware. You have to look at the software of the fuel that they're using. I mentioned the air capture. You just want to break this problem up into a lot of different components. So these things can be done in parallel. So I think the one thing, Todd, hard for me to condense this into the soundbite that I'm sure everyone wants, but the one thing I would just urge people to do is say, instead of just asking, let's have net zero, let's have a strategy for how we can bring about a transformation globally in the entire energy system and get a grip on this climate change problem globally. And I think doing it through the sectoral approach is likely to be more successful. And it's not mutually exclusive to the Paris approach. I'm not saying that. You can do both at the same time.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, thank you very much. As you're probably aware, there's a proposal for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty that's gaining quite a bit of notoriety and support from the Pope and the Dalai Lama and thousands of scientists and Nobel laureates. And all the environmental organizations have endorsed it, the major ones. But yet, it's not on the agenda, is it, internationally? So,
well, actually,
that up. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, and just really quickly on that, another difference between Montreal and the climate agreements, Montreal is controlling production and consumption of CFCs, both. Okay, the climate agreements don't do that. So they asked Norway to reduce its consumption, meaning emissions of fossil fuels within its borders and not its production of fossil fuels. Australia, same thing. Other countries, US and others, same thing. Again, this is just pointing to one of the many problems with the design approach we've taken. So if you ask countries to do the wrong thing, they're going to do the wrong thing. Let's ask them to do the right thing. And that's really the basic essence of what I'm suggesting. Thank you so much, Todd.
Thank you, Scott. It's a pleasure. And I hope to stay in touch because we're going to try to initiate some civil society conferences to discuss exactly what we should draft and what it should look like as a way to get this conversation bubbling up from the bottom for a change. Because if anything has been clear to me, the top-down approach is clearly not working. When the polluters own the governments, you're not going to get the governments to change course. So this is a grassroots battle to save the planet. And I look forward to having support from academia to structure that conversation and make sure we get up on the right footing.
Thank you so much. My hat's off to everyone who's on this call. Thank you so much for all that you do and all the care you give this. We really need you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Cheerio.
That was great. All right, and next up, now we're going to get into the nitty gritty of, so that really what you're hearing is a variety of things, but one of them is that, the United States doesn't want binding agreements, enforceable requirements to reduce greenhouse gases. So that's exactly what we're going to talk about now with Matt Harbour, who's currently a senior engineer for the Eastern Research Group and has over 40 years of experience as an air pollution professional. He was formerly deputy director for the air division of the EPA Region 9, where he developed air pollution control plans, including control strategies, emission inventories, monitoring, enforcement. So the EPA is hard at work, as not just rumor, but some news is saying, and they're hard at work revisiting the ability to come up with a new clean power plant plan, or all the initiatives to try to regulate greenhouse gas at their source and maybe even in ambient air. So without further ado, we're going to have Matt come and tell us the lay of the land and his wisdom about what law and power the EPA has currently and where this is headed.
Thanks very much, Todd. So Scott and Eric both talked about sort of the international front, and what I'm going to talk about is what's happening and what could happen on the domestic front, led by the EPA, although EPA is far from the only player on this. And just as a sort of footnote to all of this, since Scott in particular talked a lot about binding treaties, enforcement, and so on. Part of my background that Todd didn't mention is I spent the last years in my career working for the headquarters EPA Air Enforcement Office. And part of what I did is actually work on the enforceability provisions of the Clean Power Plan. So enforcement is near and dear to my heart. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about how EPA got the authority to regulate greenhouse gases, what it's done, what it hasn't done, and what it could do, and perhaps why that's not enough. So in the mid-2000s, there was a case called Massachusetts versus EPA, where the court found that EPA did in fact have the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions if it made certain findings, which in fact EPA did. And the first thing that EPA did once it had made those findings was to regulate emissions from cars. And you'll remember standards came out under the Obama administration, which the next guys tried to undermine and did such a bad job of it that pretty much failed in the courts. So that at least set the stage for regulating the transportation sector. And in the vein of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, they weren't great standards. California has far exceeded those standards. We need to move towards full electrification of the entire mobile fleet. California and some other states are doing that. But that was the first very important step. And what that action triggered was regulation in the stationary source sector. So basically EPA in air pollution world roughly regulates things that move and things that don't move. Things that move are cars, trucks, buses, and so on. Things that don't move are things like power plants, refineries, factories, and the like. And EPA decided to regulate those in two ways. And it actually had a choice. So it could either set technology-based standards, which are regulated under Section 111 of the Clean Air Act, or it could set an ambient standard, a little bit like the ozone standard or the particulate standard that many of you are familiar with, that is somewhat reported to you if you look at a site like Purple Air or Air Now. So those are ambient standards. What's in the air, is that healthy or not, or does it need to get to a lower level? So EPA could have said, we can set an ambient level for CO2, which wouldn't be met anywhere, and the states have to come up with plans to get there. EPA decided instead to go with a technology-based approach and said, we'll set standards for specific source categories. And the first one out of the gate was the Clean Power Plan, which would have required each state to meet a goal across all of its power plants. And that didn't do very well. There was first a challenge to it in the Supreme Court, and then the prior administration decided to come out with their own plan, which was completely ineffective. So that's up next from EPA. I can't tell you the shape of it, but it won't look like either of the past two attempts to do that, in part because there's a lot less coal out there than there was in 2008, 2010, when the Clean Power Plan came along. So it doesn't really make sense to focus on coal. There's a lot of natural gas. Combined cycle is a good part of where fossil-based generation comes from. There's still a little bit of coal. So the question EPA is going to face is, how do we drive those emissions down in a legally defensible way? And those are both really important because we know there will be a challenge. The other part of it is that all of that rulemaking, particularly the mobile source rulemaking, triggered a requirement that said, if there's a permit issued under the Clean Air Act to a stationary source of emissions, again, stationary sources are like power plants, refineries, cement plants, glass plants, and the like. If there's a permit and those emissions would exceed a certain amount, then those emissions of CO2 or CO2 equivalents have to be regulated and a technology standard set for those. So that was actually a very, very powerful tool that can help drive technology forward. This is actually something that I personally did in the 90s, which was to drive NOx emissions down by 80% from these combined cycle plants. So in a similar way, EPA did some research and said, for these 10 source categories, here's current technology, here's up and coming technology. These are the sorts of things that states should look at when they're setting those technology-based sources for new and modified sources. Well, the paper that Todd attached to my bio that all of you have, a colleague and I did some research and we found that the states have been remarkably ineffective in setting those technology standards. So what could EPA do? Well, EPA could do two things. One is build on those 10 source categories and update them regularly. Technology is moving at lightning speed. So for example, in the steel sector, we now have zero carbon steel available as the technology. We can make steel, which is one of the most carbon intensive technologies, for zero carbon. That's a pretty big deal. Glass making long has been something that can be made with electricity 100%. Most glass plants use a certain amount of electricity, but they use natural gas as part of their heat source. They can go 100% electric. And this goes through every single source category. But it's difficult for the states, for their permitting engineers to make that leap. They have tremendous political pressure to get permits out quickly, to not make a lot of waves and not annoy industry, because industry will say, well, we'll go next door or we'll go overseas. So what EPA needs to do is reassert its oversight role. And basically that means when a permit is drafted, EPA needs to look at the permit and say, hey, state, did you really do a good job here? Here's a bunch of information that maybe you ignored, maybe you didn't have the guts to incorporate into your permit. And these are technologies that are available today that need to be part of that permit. So between those two and some actions that EPA has taken recently in terms of methane reduction, so basically leaks of methane during its production and transmission, and HFCs, there is the potential for, roughly speaking, an economy-wide grab at all the greenhouse gas emissions. So it could be done. It just takes political will and ratcheting down all those technologies. Again, looking at the mobile sector, there was a good start. We need to move from a good start to zero emissions. Those technologies are available for virtually every source category today, and we just need the political will and the investment to make those happen. So that's in a nutshell what's going on at EPA, and I can take any questions that you have.
Wonderful, Matt. Thank you so much. We had a much more in-depth conversation the other day, and I was afraid we were going to lose everyone. And boy, did you make it concise and clear. Thank you so much for making the complicated accessible to the activists. All right, I can't believe it. I don't have a firm follow-up, except for I've been thinking, we need movements think in terms of demands. So it seems as though EPA is our next best last hope in the next year or so, as Congress fumbles and intentionally every effort. So, I'm not asking you to come up with those for today, but if you could help us crystallize what the demand is of EPA, a couple of them, maybe there's a few of them, so that we know what to push for, that would be very helpful. And if you have any off the top of your head, that would be great too. I understand the EPA is in the process of exploring these options and drafting something. So where are the pressure points and what should we be asking for?
Yeah, the short answer, and I'll try to come up with a more comprehensive answer, is that each of these areas that EPA currently has authority, and backing off, the simple thing would be that we would have comprehensive climate legislation. So I don't want to suggest that the current approach is the best approach, but it's what we've got at the moment. Some kind of comprehensive, nationwide, economy-wide approach would be far preferable, whether it's a cap and trade program, which I don't love, but it would work, whether it's a carbon tax, whether it's a technology-driven approach, they all would work. But we don't have that, and the prospects of getting that soon are unfortunately slim. So the short answer I would give is there needs to be pressure on the states to do their job. So each of you live in a state that has a regulatory authority, and you or other environmental groups may be paying attention to these sources as they're being permitted. So that's a pressure point. It's not just at EPA, because the action in terms of permitting is at states and in some cases at local permitting authorities. The second is, as EPA develops standards, it needs support from advocates who say, do the tough thing and make the the most technology aggressive regulation that's possible. And that's true both on when they're looking at the replacement of the Clean Power Plan and as EPA moves forward with the next set of mobile source standards. So those would be the two big things. Then the third thing I'd say is enforcement is really important. And resources are important. So talking to your legislators about making sure that EPA has adequate funding is really important.
Great. Well, we're in this relationship of whack-a-mole, you know, where everybody's fighting this pipeline and this plant, and it's a lose, you know, we don't have time for that,
Right.
Unfortunately. I mean, those are important fights, and you're seeing in the chat a couple frac gas plants in New York State were finally mixed, at least at this stage, it looks like, those fights, but they pop up like, you know, weeds. So we're looking for a comprehensive solution nationwide. So it sounds like there's some options in play and on the table, so that's good news. If there was, Mary, you wanted to ask a question?
Yes, I would like to ask Matt if oil and gas pipelines are considered stationary or moving. And we have a new phenomena, which is CO2 pipelines, which are dangerous. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's definitely an area that EPA has been spending a lot of time on because leaks, I mean, there are a lot of problems with pipelines. I don't need to tell you all that leaks happen both into the air, into the groundwater, onto the ground. So we can't say we love pipelines, but EPA has been focusing on methane leaks and other air pollution leaks from pipelines and working with states to set regulations. So they live in the stationary arena rather than the mobile arena. And then the question, if there are CO2 pipelines, if there is CCS, I don't think there's going to be, but if that does happen, then moving the captured CO2 from where it's generated to where it's either used or sequestered may occur in pipelines, and we need to make sure that it just doesn't leak out of the pipelines as well.
And then Sarah was asking about the registry for EPA notices about rulemaking.
Yeah, so all that rulemaking gets published in the Federal Register. There's not a fantastic way to get on a list and say, I want everything about this. So unfortunately, it's sometimes a matter of watching EPA press announcements or looking at the Federal Register. I can't say the process is friendly. I don't have anything better than that.
All right, well, if you hear anything, please keep us appraised if you could. All right, so I don't know if there are other questions that we need to ask. Well, CO2 leaks, some proposed CCS pipelines. I don't know if you want to answer any of these other.
So I did see one question about how underground storage might be regulated. And this is not a Clean Air Act issue. This is actually regulated under a different statute. And I think EPA is starting to think about what needs to be done to ensure that if CO2 were to be stored in underground repositories, that there are appropriate regulations in terms of integrity of the storage and that it doesn't leak, if you believe that's even possible. Again, I'm a skeptic on that, but there is authority that EPA has to move forward on that.
All right, great. Well, as I said earlier, we're very interested in getting a little bit ahead of these conversations as an activist community and civil society. I think that's the only place I've seen the pure will to do what's necessary as opposed to what's politically feasible. And our task is to change what's politically feasible by mounting a big enough push. And I get that that's a Hail Mary in and of itself, but to me, it's the last hope given the timeline. So we'd love any input. Matt is representing or a member of the EPA Alumni Network, which is the former EPA employees who have come together to do things like this, provide speakers and speaker bureau. But they're a great resource, I think, for this conversation and trying to help perhaps civil society have some stronger footing as we're in these conversations with the EPA and the government. So
Thanks for
any
having me, Todd.
closing thoughts, Matt, or?
No, just thanks for including me, and I'm happy to provide whatever other thoughts might be useful. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot of pressure that needs to be applied to our legislators, to state regulators, and the more energy and help that people can provide to that, I think that's where a difference is made.
Great. Well, that's where I'm seeing reason for hope. I've never seen a broader movement, and it's starting to coalesce and understand the value of direct action and strengthening demand. So there is momentum, an upswing, I would say. Movement is becoming vibrant and working on many fronts. Now our trick is to unite around a few centralized demands and pieces of legislation. And if we are able to do that, which is no easy feat, I think we'll see an immense amount of pressure emerge, unlike anything we've seen before. And it's become very ripe and current. So we're in the right moment to do this. Might take us a little while. But with that, I want to thank you, Matt, so much for being here. And feel free to chat with people in the chat if you feel like it. No obligation to do that. And we're going to now segue to the Congressional Action, the Congressional battle in the United States. Let's see, I've had all these other things in my mind, so I haven't really thought through about what we're going to say about that. Before we do that, I'll just talk briefly about the Earth Bill. We have three tentative co-sponsors that have expressed interest in co-sponsoring, but they're all like, well, we want somebody else to take the lead role because we're not sure how much, water we want to carry on this. So I think that's great. Three potential co-sponsors and are almost in the pocket are a great start, and we're doubling down on our search for a lead. We had a little setback in that the legislative director, where we had a strong interest, and we've been working with building relationships for months, and several meetings, has left that office. So we're a little bit regrouping there, and we're going to broaden our search. And we also have a list of Republican districts where they're experiencing particularly devastating impacts. And somewhere I hope there's this ridiculous idealistic hope that one of them is going to break ranks and join the fight to save the planet. Not optimistic about that, but we're going to be doing outreach along those lines. And ultimately what I would say is that we need a legislative strategy that is detached from the political parties. What's clear from the work that we've seen this year is that the whole strategy was wrapped up with a bow. Bernie Sanders and Senator Schumer and Biden, they had all joined forces well before the election, as you probably remember. All their teams got together and worked on joint policy efforts, and they plotted the plan to use the budget as the sole avenue for everything. And as if with the promise that it was going to be a collective pool with everybody getting a little something for their topics. And climate has been cut dramatically out of that equation in the last few days. And I can't say that it's happened without I can't say there's been a huge fight to keep it. There's been sort of an acquiesce to the political calculus of the inside. And I can appreciate everything that's been done, but it leaves us without anything to run with, right? So if you create a legislative strategy that's purely part of the political party's strategy, then you have nothing, and you have no leverage, you have no outside pressure. And when they call the question on it and say the deal's done and you're out, that's it. And everybody walks away wounded. And so it's critical that the movement craft its own legislation, that it be done with organizations that are not closely aligned with either the Working Families Party or the Democratic Party. And that we then have our own fight to fight, that we will build movement power around, and that we will launch that effort in Republican and Democratic states, knowing that ultimately the big oil control of our government has both parties in its grasp, and we have to build something big enough to force our way through that no matter who is in charge. That sounds like a huge challenge, and it is a huge challenge, But as I see the lay of the land and the results of this year, I don't see an alternative strategy that has any hope whatsoever. So that's our mission if we choose to accept it. And that's where I'm going to be putting all my efforts going forward. With that said, we're not conceding anything in the congressional fight right now, and that fight is not over. As you know, there's talks in play to hopefully have some sort of outline of the budget agreement, and everybody's signaling that that's going to come together now that they've cut all the climate pieces that upset Big Manchin and his big oil buddies. So there's an outline hopefully this week. They're trying to get that done before the president goes to visit the Pope over the weekend and then to Glasgow next week. And but then it still remains to be completed, you know, that deal. Until it's signed, it's not done. So there is a push, a press. I wouldn't call it a full court press, but it's a strong press happening from a variety of directions. I mean, lots of groups are mounting phone calls or having events in West Virginia, phone banking, letter writing campaigns for what those are worth, actions. Direct action is escalating around. And as I mentioned, 5 youth have been on a protracted hunger strike in DC, not getting nearly enough attention for that, led by Sunrise. I'm not sure if it's still continuing, but Nancy Lawrence and a few others have worked on some documents to give everybody the current lowdown of where the negotiations stand, and then a sheet on action steps that you can take, working with a variety of our partners and friends from Interfaith Power and Light, Climate Reality Project. I forget who all's in there, and my emails have been going out with things like that to do as well. It's very important that we don't even appear to be acquiescing, even if we know some of our most important things are not likely to make it, because they take that sign of weakness and they will push us down further and further and further. And this is just the beginning of the last stand with big oil. And now we have clarity about where it's going to go down, who the main obstructionists are, at least within the Democratic Party. And so it's time to push again, as hard as it seems, to want to do that. I'm suggesting that's the most important thing we can do to show a sign of strength going into this. And with that, I asked Greg if he could post some of those documents in the chat, and Nancy, and anyone else that would day 8 of the hunger strike. So if there are any updates on direct action or mobilizations around Manchin or Cinema, you know, any action plans. We don't want to get into discussion right now about everything we just covered, because we only have a few more minutes and we want to talk about action now. So does anyone want to raise their hand if that has action that they would like to emphasize? Nancy, if you're here, I'd like to start with you because you've led the effort on the new documents. If you're available.
Well, I'm here.
Just share with us your passion about it all and what keeps you motivated, you know, to keep fighting this fight.
Yeah. You know, I think what you said about not acquiescing is like really important. I think we need to fight to the end until this deal is done. And even if we don't win what we want to fight for. And so what's at stake here is that in the negotiations, a lot of the climate provisions are like, I don't know if they've been taken out completely 100% at this point today, but that's what's been in negotiation these last few days, is taking out the climate provisions, particularly the Clean Energy Payment Program, which was going to be kind of like the foundation of lowering greenhouse gas emissions. You know, and it really speaks to what are the senators thinking, not just the 2 Democrats, but all of the Republicans, about what is the standing of the United States just days before we go to the COP. You know, how are we going to be telling other countries to lower their emissions if we haven't been able to get any significant passage of legislation to do that ourselves? So in the list that we're mailing out, there are just many ways that you can contact legislators and let them know what your thinking is on this. Your Republican legislators as well, not just the two Democrats. And just let them know that, you know, the future of the younger generation is at stake here. It's a moral issue. And we want them to stand on the right side of the moral issue. Yeah, anything else that you can say to them that at this point will get to their hearts? You know, there's some information about how to send a personal letter to Senator Joe Manchin or Senator Kristen Sinema. You can send the personal letters to your own legislator as well. And there's a Dear Senator Manchin campaign, which is just encouraging a lot of letters to go to local newspapers and the New York Times. You can send them to both. Just a Dear Senator Manchin campaign. This is what your stance means to me. And so there's letters to the editor, and there are a few links to some of those papers, not to all of them, clearly. Yeah, so
Right.
anything people can do at this point.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy, and for continuing to push all of us. The pushy people are the ones who get things done, and we need more of them. So feel free to keep pushing me. I wane in my energy sometimes, and I'm pretty much back about 70%, I would say, from this year's fights. Peter, would you like to go next?
Sure, thanks, Todd. One of the things I've read about communicating with your representatives that's helpful is to tell a personal story about how climate change is directly affecting you right now. We have to make the problem urgent, not something that's in the future and distant, not something that's just going to affect our children and grandchildren, but something that's affecting us right now. And I live in Portland, Oregon on Chinook land, and was part of the millions of people in the Pacific Northwest that suffered under the heat dome in June of this year. We had 3 days of record temperatures in a row, way, way, way above normal, 108 degrees, 112 degrees, and 116 degrees on consecutive days. And during that time, and I come at this from a faith and spirit perspective, we became very concerned about our houseless neighbors. I live in an urban area that has lots of people who are unhoused around me. I know who these people are. I see them most every day. And their lives were literally at risk being out in the weather in that heat. And so we took it on ourselves to distribute water, to check in on folks, to do care of our people. And even with all that, there were more than 100 people who passed away due to the excessive heat in our sort of immediate area around Portland. So this is not something that's in the future. It's something that's causing harm right now, and it's causing harm in our communities and to people we care about. So if you can share those messages, they can be very powerful to persuading legislators to act.
Thank you so much, Peter. And I just want to reemphasize the importance of the Adopted District program and building your local teams and networks. There are many people on here who are incredible examples of that kind of organizing going on as part of the network. And you could see when it's time to mobilize them, there they are. So it's about building infrastructure, your capacity, your own local team. We've done a really good job, I think, over this year of building adopted district networks in many districts, but that work never ends. And you know how it is with volunteers, some come and some go. It's a constant struggle. So you want to find the organizations in your community that care about this, continue your outreach to them, use any hook you can find. Like right now is a good time to ask them, would you mind sending out a notice about some phone banking? Or just use any opportunity you have where something's happening currently to ignite that conversation and interest, and you form those relationships. On that front, our faith team is venturing into West Virginia. The Clean Energy Standard Group, I don't know what they'll call themselves now, has affirmed with us that there's not been a major push on faith organizations within West Virginia. So we're reaching out, Peter's reaching out, and we're going to try to build church to church relationships in West Virginia going forward. so that we have, now that we know where the front line of this fight is going down, it provides a lot of organizing clarity for moving forward. So we'll be getting back to you with more information about that. And does anyone else have any action updates? Just so you know, the filibuster fight is still going, and to carve out exemptions to that for the People's Act, the voting rights legislation, and Biden said in an offhanded remark, and other issues. So that avenue is still alive, it sounds like, but even to get the votes to get rid of the filibuster is a problem, but it seems to be very cordial within the Democratic caucus. So maybe they're building friendships that are going to be prevailed upon to actually get some of that done. Let's hope. But that fight is ongoing, and many organizations are in it and pressuring very hard from the inside. And we're talking about the Democratic base here that's very unhappy with a variety of things. So that fight's not over. So I'm saying that we should not give up on the idea of additional climate legislation in this Congress, as hard as that is, because we know the prospects for elections going forward look worse. But that's again why we need to have a movement-driven legislative demand like the Earth Bill that we control and can organize so that we fight both of these parties for the planet. Any other questions? And then you know how it is normally at 1:30, we'll stop the formal presentation and we'll take some informal questions for a little bit. But any other action reports? Anyone that was in the fight for those frac gas plants in New York State want to say a couple words of encouragement? Sarah, were you involved in that?
350 Brooklyn was. You know, it was a collaboration and on the ground, long 3 years for the Astoria plant of organizing, and a couple years for the dance camera plant, both of those that just got denied. Bird dogging first Cuomo and now Hochul, and testifying at every possible hearing, and letters to the editor, and demonstrations, and getting out on the street with clipboards and getting people's names to oppose it. So you build a huge list of people who don't want that in their, you know, in their backyard, and that's how you do it. You know, grunt work over and over again, and it gets done.
Great, great, bravo. Go ahead, David.
Thanks, Todd. Yeah, great. I just want to corroborate everything Sarah just told us. And just now I slipped away for a moment to call and thank Governor Hochul for her role in the denial of the permits for dance camera and Astoria power plants. Some of us some weeks ago from Food and Water Watch went up to Newburgh, got on some kayaks and joined a bunch of the 4 or 5 dozen good folks, some of them associated with that community. And the Clearwater vessel was on hand too. And we just got out on the water and just shouted for a complete shutdown of the dance camera project. It's great. We also have bird dogged Governor Hochul a couple times in Williamsburg, where she came for a fundraiser. That's always fun, and I think it's really effective. Give the governor a call, please, and if nothing else, thank her for, you know, again, for her role in shutting down these 2 major, prospectively disastrous power plants. Yeah.
Great, great, great.
Thanks, Todd.
Good work, everybody. Good work. Those victories are important. They're very important. And they're also evidence of how to push. Lisa's reminding us that it doesn't always work, as we know. That's why we need more comprehensive. Sarah's saying we lost 3 or 4 of the 4 pipeline fights before we finally won one. Yeah, so that shows you that these are important, but not sufficient in terms of our overall trajectory. I just want to also lift up the Green Faith Flotilla outside of Manchin's yacht that got some news. People versus fossil fuels. We haven't had a general open meeting since then, but I was there all week. Got a lot of news and attention, and that's obviously the goal, to get the news and to get they even got the Biden White House to respond in a press availability. And so does anybody, Thomas, please go ahead. You want to talk about the hunger strike? Sorry, I didn't notice that. somebody could help keep an eye on hands.
Hi, Todd. You can see me, hear me?
A
You
little
can hear me
louder.
okay? Okay. Just a brief comment. I'm among the older members of our gang, and I feel uncomfortable at the really clear initiative being taken by the young people who are most affected by global heating. And those of us who are responsible for this global heating are not on the front lines. How many kids are down there in Washington right now? We should be thousands of people with them. I say that as I sit here in New York. Why are we who have caused this problem leaving them unattended effectively in front of the White House?
Thank you, Thomas.
I include myself.
Yes, and I agree completely. We were there for a week, and I didn't even know this was about to happen, or I would have stayed down there. And I'm pretty informed, but it's hard to keep track of everything now. There's so much going on. And part of the problem is we haven't jointly queued up a demand. When we queued up the legislation in New York, there was a lot of groundwork for the queuing up of that. And so by the time there were mass civil disobedience and hundreds of people arrested, there was buy-in. So we're in this sort of bizarre zone where we're following the politicians instead of leading from the movement as to our demands and not building that groundwork. With that, I know that we have Lisa wants to say something. Lisa, go ahead.
Thank you, Todd. I fully support your regeneration of getting behind a bill that we create. We have clear demands. I'm also curious on what is our group status on the non-proliferation treaty.
Well, thank you for mentioning that. We had our last meeting like this one had the whole presentation on that, so it's up on the YouTube channel. We've been meeting with and having meetings and organizing meetings very actively with the treaty initiative in New York City. And Catherine Scope is not here today, but she cornered 5, I think, city councilors on the sidewalk outside of the city hall the other day and got yeses from all 5 of them about it. And one of them is the lead sponsor of it's just a resolution to support the idea, but it's still something you can do at the local level. So we've had a couple meetings on that, and Nydia Leaf is involved in that, and Catherine Skopik are very active, and they know a lot of city councilors. So that's where things stand. Internationally, I've been stirring the pot, as it were, on the International Climate Action Network calls to really lift this up, and there's a lot of receptivity to it there, and they've endorsed it, and US Canada's endorsing it. And so the question is, what are the next steps that we can take? And my thought is that we need to come together in civil society for maybe a full day conference and actually draft what we think should be in that treaty. We could do fossil fuel non-proliferation, and we can also do greenhouse gas a la the Kigali Agreement and the Montreal Protocol. And we just need, from the abstract to the specific. And then agreement, if we write it together, we will fight for it together. So that's my thinking. I'm waiting for the energy to come to me to and start doing the inviting and convening to try to pull something that off. And if folks are liking that idea and interested in that, please let me know. Any other thoughts in closing before we go? I'm sure once we hang up, I'll feel like we forgot many things. But today was a great meeting. We have good attendance. We've been at this, everybody, for quite a while, as you know. We're meeting regularly on Monday nights at 8 o'clock. Those meetings ebb and flow depending on how much notice I get for them. And we might postpone those for a little bit so I can take a breather. I keep saying that, but then more keeps coming. And I said, well, let's just keep meeting, because every Monday night, there's interesting events that come up that somebody's gotten a new co-sponsor, and it's just sometimes great to see everyone. It is a little bit draining. We've been meeting weekly since 2018, almost without stop, a very few exceptions. David knows Climate Mondays started this fight for federal legislation in 2018. Just to recap, the All Fossil Fuels Act was the document we used to organize around, and we got Sunrise and DSA and AOC when she was just a candidate on board. And so having a bill to organize is critical for building a movement. So I can't emphasize it enough. We really would love more of your organizations to endorse the Earth Bill as we're working to get it filed. We're up to, I don't know, about 45 organizations and over 240 individuals associated with dozens of organizations. And so these are the building blocks. And so we need more organizations. And if our own organizations can't put their names on the line for a bold move, then what is our hope? So, you know, we need to really bite the bullet and get your groups to sign on for that, even though it's a wish and a prayer. It's much easier to get people to support the treaty initiative because it has all the big names on it, but all those big names are not fighting for the treaty, you know? So we're gonna fight for this, you know, we're gonna make it happen. And so I believe in this path because I know that the Equality Act happened like this, and I was on the ground and led that organizing. And once you build it up enough, then all of a sudden the movement embraces the idea. And once the movement embraces the idea, then we're on to a path of, you know, viability. And so, you know, it has to start somewhere, and it really starts with us. Any last closing thoughts anyone wants to share? Gratitude for anything that I have great gratitude for all of you, and appreciation for everyone who's stuck through this whole journey together. It's been quite wonderful, but it's really just the beginning. And it was very dispiriting this year to watch how closely aligned the climate movement is with the political apparatus, and then how quickly the climate goals were cut and the fight ended almost. And as I say,
hello.
groups are still fighting, but we need a new plan because this is not working yet. Who wanted to say something?
Hello, Todd. I joined in and I was listening into the presentations, and you know, I thought that was excellent. And I just have it's not a question, but it's more of a comment. And it's something that we can do so that we can be more proactive, even if it's, because sometimes what happens is that it is very difficult for some people to attend rallies and attend other in-person events because of different events that come up or commitments. One easier way that can be done is if anybody has the Climate Action Now app, that can be downloaded into the App Store from either the iPhone or the Google Play, and every day it gives you climate action items, and you can share those items into the social media, and that goes to the legislators.
Wonderful, thank you. We're always looking for the best way to conduct our activism. So thank you very much for that offering. And if you could send me an email with that link, and I'll make sure it gets into our general announcement.
Yes, and another thing that I want to mention is, that though when you record the action, if anybody is a climate leader or has been trained through the Climate Reality and has the Climate Reality Hub, that automatically becomes recorded in the Climate Reality Hub, and it can count as an act of leadership.
Wonderful. And Climate Reality has a 24 hours of action, I think it's called, on the 29th, which I guess is a couple days. And that link is in the emails that I sent out, the one before last, I think, or maybe even today. I'm losing track. So great. Join all of those. You know, it shows that everybody is mobilizing, and that's really a key step. And you look back 8 months ago.
Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you. Look back 8 months ago, we weren't in this kind of rallying activism mode. So it really has taken off. There's going to be a lull now once the budget gets passed because people don't have a demand in play. And part of the problem strategically is that we have 1 million people, thousands of groups asking everyone to call somebody for something different. And that just dilutes our power and almost makes it, well, dilutes it tremendously. And my strategic opinion is that until we are all working on a core set of demands together, we do not have the power that the potential, we don't have the power of our potential. yet realized. So we have to go from a smattering of 1,000 different points of light to a laser beam. And that is the trick in finding the demand. And so we're going to be in this conversation in November. We're going to go over the Earth Bill again and its origins and how it was derived from the Climate Crisis Policy Digest, which was an analysis of over 150 reports and laws and bills. We found the 3 top consensus items: renewable electricity, zero emission vehicles, regenerative agriculture. We put them in a bill, electricity, cars, and food. That's easy to understand. That's something that the public can relate to and take action on if once we get it filed. Has a catchy name. The Earth is a popular topic. These are the ingredients that are necessary for coming up with the collective ask. So we'll be revisiting that journey, reintroducing it to a broader array of people again, now that their attention spans might be open to new ideas and new approaches, and forging ahead with that as fast as we can in the ensuing months. And with that, we can end the recording, say bye to Greg, and I'll stay on a few seconds and a few minutes and see if anyone has any further questions that they want to ask me. And just thank you all again for everything you're doing and for everything that we're going to do.